Do you really think you know Yes? The band that gifted us with progressive symphonies, ethereal lyrics, and a musical complexity bordering on the divine. Those long-haired lads, virtuoso instrumentalists, rock poets who built sonic cathedrals for open minds. The public image is one of masters of harmony, innovators who challenge the limits of popular music. But what if I told you that behind this facade of genius and artistic enlightenment lurked a dark, brutal, and relentless side that shaped the band as much as their transcendental melodies? A side that many fans, even the most dedicated, prefer to ignore or simply never had the chance to uncover. This isn't a stroll through the Garden of Eden of progressive rock. Prepare for a deep dive into the guts of one of history's greatest bands, where genius often walked hand in hand with tyranny, artistic vision clashed with monumental egos, and the pursuit of perfection could easily turn into pure cruelty. We're going to dissect Yes not as the immaculate legend history sometimes paints them, but as a living, pulsating, and at times, ailing organism, where beauty was born from a cauldron of passions, conflicts, and decisions that left deep scars. To understand the dark side of Yes, one must first strip the band of its mythical cloak. Forget for a moment the flowery arrangements and Roger Dean's album covers. Think of Yes as a human experiment, a melting pot of incredibly strong personalities, each with their own baggage, ambitions, and neuroses. From the beginning, the band was an arena of clashes. John Anderson, the visionary, the dreamer, the voice that guided us through realms of pure imagination, was also a leader with an inflexible vision, a man capable of inspiring and, at the same time, exhausting those around him with his relentless pursuit of an almost unattainable perfection. He wanted to build the music of the future, and for that, he didn't hesitate to dismantle the present. His belief in the interconnectedness between the universe, spirituality, and music was the driving force behind many of Yes's abstract lyrics and epic compositional structures. He envisioned a sound that transcended the mundane, that would elevate the listener to a higher plane of consciousness. And to achieve that vision, he was willing to push everyone's limits, including his own, to the breaking point. The purity of his intention, paradoxically, was also the source of his intransigence, making him a catalyst for both the creation of masterpieces and the implosion of relationships. The almost mystical aura that surrounded him, especially at the band's peak in the 70s, elevated him to an almost messianic figure for many fans, which only reinforced his conviction that he was on the right path, no matter the personal cost to the other members. And Steve Howe, the guitarist who redefined what an electric guitar could do in progressive rock, with his impeccable technique and musical eclecticism. Howe was the sonic architect, the master of tones, but also a relentless perfectionist, with a standard of demand that very few could match. His critical eye could be devastating, and his demeanor, at times, bordered on arrogance. He knew what he wanted and how he wanted it, and if you weren't up to par, well, the door was always open. His meticulousness in every phrase, every harmony, every string arrangement was legendary. Howe spent hours searching for the perfect tone, experimenting with different amplifiers, pedals, and, of course, his vast collection of guitars, which were almost an extension of his own body. His discipline was ironclad, and he expected the same level of dedication from his bandmates. When that expectation wasn't met, he didn't hesitate to express his dissatisfaction, often directly and without filters. His reserved personality, coupled with this professional intensity, created a barrier, making it difficult for other members to approach and understand his motivations. For Howe, music was an exact science and a sublime art, and any deviation from precision or the idealized vision was unacceptable. Rick Wakeman, the keyboard wizard, the showman, the virtuoso who brought a dose of theatricality and classical brilliance to the band. Wakeman was, without a doubt, a genius, but also a disruptive force, a man of intense passions and strong opinions who didn't easily bend. His departures and returns to the band became almost a rite of passage, a testament to the inherent tensions within Yes. Wakeman was a hurricane of energy, a musician with overwhelming talent, and an extroverted personality that often contrasted with the almost monastic seriousness of other members. He brought an element of spontaneity and, at times, irreverence, which could be invigorating or exasperating depending on the situation. His ability to compose and improvise in various styles, from classical to jazz, rock to folk, made him an invaluable asset to Yes's expansive sound. However, his impatience with Anderson and Howe's slow compositional methodology and their propensity for conceptual digressions were constant sources of friction. Wakeman was a man of action, who preferred execution to excessive theorizing, and this fundamental difference in approaches often led to direct confrontations, often laden with sarcastic humor that wasn't always well understood by the others. He didn't mince words and expressed his displeasure bluntly, which, though honest, didn't always contribute to a harmonious working environment. Chris Squire, the thunder bassist, the rhythmic and melodic backbone of the band, a musician with a unique sound and an imposing presence. Squire was, for many, the true heart of Yes, the link between extremes. But even he, with his apparent stability, was a man of strong convictions, capable of abrupt decisions and of holding the line when he believed the band's integrity was at stake. His stage presence was magnetic, and his Rickenbacker bass, with its distinctive, almost guitar-like sound, was the foundation upon which all of Yes's complexity was built. Squire was a pillar, not only musically, but also in terms of the band's organizational structure, often mediating conflicts and trying to find common ground between explosive personalities. However, his firm nature and unwavering loyalty to the Yes vision also meant that he could be stubborn and inflexible when he felt the band's direction was being compromised. He was a guardian of the sound, a protector of Yes's identity, and this responsibility led him to make difficult decisions that weren't always popular, but which he believed were essential for the band's survival and integrity. His death left an immense void, not only musically, but also in terms of his ability to be the anchor point in the midst of the storm. And, of course, Bill Bruford, Alan White, Patrick Moraz, Trevor Rabin, each brought their own dynamic, their own talents, and inevitably their own conflicts to the equation. The history of Yes is a kaleidoscope of brilliant musicians, each with their indelible mark, but also with their share of frustrations and disillusionments. The band was a living organism, constantly evolving and, at times, constantly self-destructing, a testament to the price paid for collective genius and the relentless pursuit of something that transcends the ordinary. The complexity of their personalities, their ambitions, their fears, and their hopes formed the intricate tapestry that is the story of Yes, a story of triumphs and tribulations, of glory and shadows. The dark side of Yes wasn't just manifested in heated arguments and discussions, though there were many. It was revealed in the way members were discarded, like chess pieces on a complex board, in the name of an artistic vision that wasn't always shared by everyone. The search for the perfect lineup was a constant, resulting in a revolving door of musicians who left the band, often with feelings of resentment and bitterness. It was a vicious cycle. A member would join, bring new energy and perspective, contribute to one or two innovative albums, but the inherent tensions in the band's dynamic would eventually lead to their exhaustion or departure. With each change, Yes reinvented itself, but left behind a trail of broken hearts and impacted musical careers. Personal loyalty was often sacrificed at the altar of musical evolution, a powerful but not always humane justification. Think of the original drummer, Bill Bruford, a brilliant musician with a jazzy and inventive style, fundamental to the band's early records. He was one of the pillars that built Yes's sound. However, the rigidity of the band's musical structure, the long hours of rehearsal, and the relentless pursuit of intricate arrangements began to suffocate him. Bruford, a man of restless mind, yearned for freedom and experimentation. His decision to leave Yes to join King Crimson was seen by many as a betrayal, but for him, it was a matter of artistic survival. He could no longer bear the exhausting repetition and the absence of space for spontaneous improvisation that he so valued. The routine of perfectionist rehearsals, where every beat was meticulously planned and executed, went against his exploratory nature. Bruford desired an environment where he could take risks, where music was a continuous flow of discoveries and not a rigid execution of predetermined scores. The way the news was received within the band, with a mixture of shock and a certain disdain for his lack of loyalty, reveals the intensity of expectations and the difficulty in accepting that someone might want a different path. The Yes family could be a suffocating embrace, demanding unconditional adherence to its vision, with no room for dissent. Bruford's departure was one of the first major shocks, a harbinger of the many turbulences to come. He sought his own voice in more experimental projects, proving that his decision, though painful for Yes, was essential for his own artistic development. And what about Tony Kaye, the original keyboardist, whose contribution, though more direct and bluesy than his successors, was essential to the band's first steps? Kaye was, in essence, fired to make way for Rick Wakeman, an undeniably more virtuous musician and aligned with the progressive direction Yes wanted to take. The coldness with which these decisions were made, the prioritization of vision over personal feelings, was a hallmark of the band. Kaye had a more organic approach, more rooted in rhythm and blues and classic rock, which, at first, gave Yes a solid and accessible foundation. However, as the band leaned towards longer, more complex and symphonic compositions, the limitations of his style became evident in the eyes of Anderson and Howe, who sought a keyboardist capable of emulating entire orchestras and mastering a myriad of sounds. Wakeman, with his arsenal of keyboards and prodigious technique, was the answer. The replacement, though musically justified by the direction the band was taking, was executed with an impersonality that bordered on cruelty. There was no room for sentimentality when the music was at stake. Genius came at a high price, and the currency was often emotional stability and camaraderie. Kaye's departure was not an act of malice, but rather of cold artistic rationality, a necessary sacrifice for Yes to reach its full potential. However, the impact on Kaye was profound, and he carried the resentment for many years, even when he returned to the band at a later period. These weren't just backstage stories of any rock band. They were demonstrations of a high-pressure environment where excellence was the only metric of acceptability. Yes, was not a democracy in the traditional sense. It was a monarchy, at times absolutist, where the crown of artistic vision passed from hand to hand, and each bearer imposed their will with surprising ferocity. The line between artistic passion and authoritarianism was thin and often blurred. Decisions were often made by a small core, with little or no consultation with other members, especially those considered less essential to the central vision. This modus operandi, while effective in maintaining a cohesive and ambitious artistic line, generated growing resentment among those who felt marginalized or whose contributions were underestimated. The hierarchy, though informal, was clearly established, and the voice of John Anderson, and often Steve Howe and Chris Squire, carried infinitely more weight than that of the others. The composition and recording process also revealed this dark side. The endless hours in the studio, the physical and mental exhaustion, the search for every perfect note, every nuance of arrangement, could push musicians to their limits. There are reports of recording sessions lasting for days on end, with very few breaks, under the relentless supervision of Anderson and Howe, who often had a preconceived idea of how the music should sound and wouldn't rest until that vision was realized. Perfectionism, which resulted in some of the most complex and beautiful music ever created, was also a constant source of friction and frustration. The atmosphere in the studio could be tense, charged with expectations, and an almost unbearable pressure to deliver the definitive performance. Every small imperfection was dissected, every mistake repeated to exhaustion. Musicians often felt like cogs in a complex machine, their individualities being shaped and, at times, crushed by the grandeur of the collective project. The joy of artistic creation was often overshadowed by the rigor of the process, transforming the studio into a battlefield where creativity fought against exhaustion. Many musicians who passed through Yes described the experience as intensely challenging, a trial by fire not only of their technical skills, but also of their mental resilience. Yes, at its peak, was not a club of friends making music. It was a creative machine, a sound laboratory where personal emotions were often sacrificed at the altar of art. The intensity of cohabitation, the constant pressure for excellence, and the often volatile nature of the personalities involved created an environment conducive to burnout. It was not uncommon for musicians to leave the band exhausted, both physically and mentally, needing time to recover from the overwhelming experience. Individual contribution was valued, yes, but always as a function of the whole, of the grand vision of Yes. And if that contribution didn't align perfectly, friction was inevitable. Consider the tensions during the recording of Tales from Topographic Oceans, an ambitious, grandiose album that divided critics and fans, but which for the band represented a pinnacle of their progressive vision. However, backstage accounts speak of creative chaos, with John Anderson and Steve Howe immersed in an almost mystical journey of composition, while Rick Wakeman, skeptical of the length and complexity of the tracks, openly expressed his discontent. He felt the album was bloated, pretentious, and that the band was losing touch with its roots. Arguments were constant, the atmosphere heavy. Wakeman, in an act of silent rebellion, even ordered a bowling alley and watched football games during recording sessions, an act of provocation that underscored his frustration with the musical direction and recording process. He saw the album's indulgence as a strategic mistake that could alienate the audience and lead the band to a dead end. His criticism was not in bad faith, but a reflection of his practical personality and his desire to keep the music accessible, even within the progressive context. His departure after this album was no surprise and reveals the impossibility of reconciling such disparate visions in such an intense project. The cost of artistic grandeur was internal cohesion. Tales was a watershed moment, not only for the band but for progressive rock as a whole, symbolizing the extremes to which the genre could go, both in terms of ambition and polarization. The dark side also manifested in the band's relationship with the public and critics. Yes, like many of their progressive contemporaries, was often accused of elitism, of creating music for a select and intellectualized audience, ignoring accessibility and simplicity. While this was an intrinsic characteristic of the genre, the band's often distant and art-focused demeanor contributed to this perception. There was a certain air of superiority, an unwavering belief in the validity of their own vision, which could be interpreted as arrogance by those who couldn't or wouldn't delve into its complexities. Yes wasn't concerned with pleasing the masses. Their mission was to explore the frontiers of music, and if that meant leaving some behind, so be it. This attitude, though authentic to their artistic nature, also created a barrier between the band and a larger portion of the audience. The specialized press, often divided between admiration for virtuosity and criticism of pretension, reflected this polarization. The band, in turn, often ignored or disdained negative reviews, reinforcing the perception of their unwavering self-confidence, or, for some, their disconnection from reality. The Going for the One tour, for example, after Wakeman's return and the attempt at a more concise and pop approach, also revealed tensions. The band was trying to adapt to a new musical landscape, but internal pressure and artistic differences persisted. The album, though successful, was a compromise, an attempt to balance progressive complexity with a more direct structure, something not all members fully embraced. The transition to a more accessible sound, led in part by Chris Squire's influence, was not without friction, especially with Steve Howe, who saw simplification as a dilution of Yes's identity. The genius that propelled them also fragmented them. The comings and goings of members, the copyright disputes, the public statements revealing grievances and resentments, all of this was part of the dark plot that few fans truly understood in its entirety. These wounds did not heal easily, and were often reopened with each new band reconfiguration. The post-downtime period, when the band fragmented into competing versions, the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe, ABWH lineup, which many saw as the return of classic Yes, and Chris Squire and Alan White's Yes with Trevor Rabin, is perhaps the most vivid example of this dark side. was a war of egos and legacies, a battle for possession of the Yes name, which dragged on for years and left a trail of frustration and bitterness among the musicians and, consequently, among the fans. The idea that two bands could coexist with the same name, with swapped members, was a symptom of the deep dysfunction that had set in. The lawsuits, the inflamed public statements, the division of fan loyalty, all of this turned what should have been a celebration of music into a lamentable spectacle of disunity. Each side defended its own legitimacy, its own version of the truth, creating confusion that only served to obscure the artistic brilliance that had once united them. The dispute over the name was not just a legal or financial matter. It was a battle for the soul of Yes, for the interpretation of its legacy. This dispute wasn't just about who had the legal right to use the name. It was about who represented the true essence of Yes, who carried the torch of the original vision. And this battle of narratives, fought in interviews, on different stages, and even in courtrooms, exposed the band's open wound in a brutal way. The genius that united them to create albums like Close to the Edge and Fragile was eclipsed by the bitterness of separation. The conflict between classic Yes and 901.25 Yes, with Trevor Rabin, represented a fundamental cleavage in musical and aesthetic directions. On one side, complex and ethereal progressive tradition. On the other, a more modern, accessible and radio-oriented sound. Both incarnations had their merits and their defenders, but the inability to coexist peacefully or to resolve their differences amicably revealed the depth of the divisions and the intransigence of the personalities involved. Fans found themselves in an uncomfortable position, forced to choose sides, and many felt that the band's integrity was being compromised. And the Union reunion in 1991, an apparent triumph of reconciliation, with 8 members on stage, a celebration of the band's history. But backstage reveals a very different story. It was a forced union, a temporary truce for a lucrative tour, where coexistence was, at best, tense and at worst, unbearable. The musicians recorded their parts separately, rarely meeting in the studio. The union was a mirage, a veneer of camaraderie that barely hid the deep scars. There are reports that John Anderson refused to share the stage with certain members at certain times, and that communication between them was minimal, often mediated by managers. The irony of an album called Union being recorded and promoted in an environment of such disunity is one of the harshest truths about the dark side of Yes. The album's recording process was a logistical and personal nightmare, with each musician recording their parts in different studios, on different continents, and the tracks later assembled by producers trying to create cohesion from chaos. The result was an album that, despite some brilliant moments, sounded fragmented and lacked the organic soul that characterized Yes's great works. The subsequent tour, though a financial success, was a test of endurance for the musicians, who forced themselves to perform together while tensions simmered backstage. The public image of a happy musical family was a convenient fiction, a fairy tale carefully constructed for media and fan consumption. This union was more a temporary armistice than a true reconciliation, and the cracks in Yes's foundation continued to deepen. Even in moments of greatest success and recognition, the shadow persisted. The constant pursuit of innovation, of transcending limits, though admirable, was also a source of instability. Yes never settled, never contented itself with repeating formulas. This restlessness, which generated masterpieces, also meant that the band was always in a state of flux, of constant redefinition, which was exhausting for the members themselves and often confusing for the public. The need to reinvent oneself, never to stagnate, was both a blessing and a curse. If, on the one hand, it guaranteed artistic relevance and the evolution of the sound, on the other, it prevented the formation of a stable base, both in terms of lineup and musical direction. Each new album was a dive into the unknown, a daring gamble that could result in genius or controversy. And with that constant uncertainty came immense pressure, a feeling that the ground beneath their feet was never entirely firm. The personal relationships within the band were a labyrinth of complexities. There were deep friendships, yes, but also fierce rivalries, veiled jealousies, and power struggles. The vision of Yes as a whole often clashed with individual ambitions, with each musician's need to express their own identity. And when these tensions became unbearable, the result was inevitable. Another member withdrew, or was asked to withdraw. The coexistence of such strong and talented personalities in such an intimate space and under such pressure created a minefield of emotions. Small differences of opinion could quickly escalate into open confrontations, and resentments accumulated over time emerged at inopportune moments. The initial camaraderie, which united the members around a common dream, often gave way to a power dynamic, where the struggle for artistic and creative control was constant. The band was, in essence, a magnified reflection of the complexities of human relationships, but with the peculiarity that every disagreement had the potential to impact the trajectory of one of the greatest rock bands in history. Think of the story of Patrick Moraz, the Swiss keyboardist who took Wakeman's place for the album Relayer. Moraz was a talented musician with a more avant-garde and jazzy approach. His contribution to Relayer is undeniable, a brutal album in its intensity and complexity. However, his time with the band was brief. When Wakeman expressed interest in returning, Moraz was promptly dismissed. The official narrative was that the doors were always open for the classic members, but for Moraz, it was a painful experience of being treated as a temporary substitute, a mere gap filler. He was perceived as a step-in, a talented musician, but not part of the core family of Yes. The decision to replace him was not based on his lack of talent or contribution, but rather on a nostalgic preference and an attempt to re-establish the classic lineup that it was believed was most popular among fans. This in-and-out dynamic of members, based more on conveniences and the return of old guards than on a fair assessment of individual contribution, is an often neglected aspect of the band's dark side. Moraz, despite his excellence, felt the weight of being a replaceable link in Yes's creative chain. The cruelty inherent in the relentless pursuit of a grandiose artistic vision also manifested in self-demand. These musicians were not just talented, they were obsessed. The long hours of rehearsal, the exhaustive repetition of difficult passages, the pressure to perform live with the same precision and virtuosity as studio recordings. All of this led to a level of stress that few artists could endure. Yes, at its peak, allowed no weakness. You were in or you were out. The pursuit of perfection was a religion, and the dedication required was almost monastic. Self-discipline was fierce, and the mutual demand to achieve an impossible standard of excellence was constant. This mindset, while responsible for creating music of unparalleled complexity and beauty, was also deeply draining. Many members reported feeling constantly under scrutiny, with the sense that any slip could be grounds for questioning their continued presence in the band. The stage was a battlefield, where each performance was a test, a proof of their dignity and worth as a Yes musician. Physical and mental exhaustion was a constant companion, but the passion for the music and the belief in the grandeur of the project propelled them to continue, even when body and mind cried out for rest. And the personal impact of all this? The lives of these musicians, behind the glory and glamour, were often marked by personal sacrifices, by broken relationships, by a constant tension that affected their health and well-being. The music of the future demanded a high price, and not everyone was willing or able to pay it indefinitely. The intensity of the work, the pressure of deadlines, the relentless touring, all contributed to an environment that was, to say the least, unhealthy. Drugs and alcohol, for some, became escape valves, a way to cope with the relentless creative demand and interpersonal tensions. It wasn't just rock and roll excess, but a desperate attempt to find some relief in an environment that demanded the maximum at every moment. The rock star glamour often hid a reality of loneliness, stress, and self-destruction. Constant travel, absence from home, difficulty in maintaining stable relationships, all took their toll. Many musicians, after intense periods with Yes, confessed to feeling exhausted, disoriented, and struggling to regain a sense of normalcy in their lives. Art was everything, but the human cost was immense. The pressure to maintain a public image of success and cohesion added another layer of stress, forcing members to hide their internal struggles and present a facade of unity that did not always correspond to the reality behind the scenes. The dark side of Yes also extends to how the band dealt with its own history and legacy. There is a tendency, especially among the most devoted fans and the band itself, to gloss over the periods of greatest turbulence, to rewrite the narrative to focus only on artistic triumphs. The discords, the dismissals, the legal battles. All of this is often minimized or swept under the rug in favor of a more unified and heroic image. But the truth is that these moments of conflict and separation were as defining for Yes as their masterpieces. They shaped the band, forced evolutions, and in some cases, led to the creation of music that otherwise would never have existed. The pain and struggle were an integral part of the creative process. The history of Yes is not linear, nor is it an uninterrupted ascent to glory. It is a saga full of ups and downs, confrontations and reconciliations, ruptures and reinventions. To ignore the moments of darkness is to ignore a fundamental part of the journey, a part that paradoxically contributed to the band's depth and resilience. The official narrative often tries to smooth the edges, polish the image, but the truth is that Yes's most intense beauty often arose from friction, from the collision of ideas and personalities. The death of Chris Squire in 2015 was a devastating blow, but it also exposed the fragility of the Yes brand and the complexities of its legacy. The different factions of the band, each with its own interpretation of what Yes should be, continued to exist, generating more confusion and, for some fans, a feeling of betrayal. The search for authenticity and the true lineage of Yes became an endless debate, an echo of past battles that were never truly resolved. Squire's absence, the most consistent member and, for many, the heart of the band, left an irreparable void and exacerbated questions about the legitimacy of the different incarnations of Yes that continued to perform. Who holds the flame? Who has the right to carry the legacy? These questions, already present for decades, became even more poignant after the loss of one of its founding pillars. The grief for the loss of an icon mingled with the frustration over the perpetuation of divisions, turning the celebration of his life and work into a bittersweet reminder of open wounds. What fans don't know, or perhaps don't want to know, is that the beauty and grandeur of Yes did not emerge in a vacuum of harmony and peace. They were forged in an intense fire of egos, ambitions, disagreements, and, at times, a veiled cruelty that was necessary to keep the artistic vision on course. Yes's genius was wild, untamed, and took no prisoners. It was a force of nature, chaotic and creative, demanding total and unconditional surrender from its participants. Those who couldn't keep up or who diverged from the dominant vision were inevitably left behind. This brutality, though difficult to accept, was an essential engine for the band's innovation and audacity. There was no room for hesitation or for compromises that could dilute the essence of what Yes sought to be. This is not an attempt to demystify or denigrate Yes. On the contrary, it is an invitation to appreciate the band in its entirety, with all its facets, including the roughest and most difficult ones. To understand the dark side of Yes is to understand the complexity of artistic creation at its highest level. It is to recognize that the pursuit of perfection, of music that defies time and conventions, often requires unthinkable sacrifices and almost superhuman resilience. It is a reminder that art, in its purest and most ambitious form, is rarely a clean and harmonious process. On the contrary, it is often a battlefield, where the artist fights against their own demons, against external expectations, and against the limits of their own imagination and skill. The story of Yes is a mirror of this struggle, a testament that the most dazzling beauty can emerge from the deepest conflict. When you listen to And You and I, or Heart of the Sunrise next time, try to think not only of the beauty of the melodies and the complexity of the arrangements. Think of the sweat, the tears, the heated arguments, the endless hours in the studio, the colliding egos, the loneliness of the artist in search of something only they can glimpse. Think of the pressure, the demands, the relentless pursuit of a perfect note, a precise rhythm, a transcendent harmony. Imagine the palpable tension in the studio air, the frustration of an idea that doesn't materialize, the exhaustion bordering on despair. But also imagine the moment when everything clicks, when the vision manifests in sound, and the magic of yes becomes real, even if for a brief instant. These moments of triumph which justified all the suffering were the fuel that kept the yes machine moving. The dark side of yes is not a secret to be hidden, but an intrinsic part of its legend, a testament to the passion and intensity that were necessary to create some of the most innovative and enduring music in rock history. It is proof that, to reach the divine, sometimes you have to descend into hell, and it is precisely this journey, with all its glories and its scars, that makes Yes such a fascinating and eternally relevant band.